What you are about to hear is one of the most heartbreaking and ultimately triumphant stories you will ever listen to. I want you to stop whatever you are doing right now and really hear this, because this is not just a story about one woman. This is a story about every woman who was ever underestimated, every woman who was told she was too much, or not enough, at the same time. Every woman who loved with everything she had and was repaid with cruelty. And it is a story about the terrifying, beautiful, inevitable power of truth, the way it can stay buried for only so long before it erupts through the ground like a geyser, scalding everything in its path. So if you are ready, let us go to a village called Mbeya. Let us go back to the beginning. The fire began on a Tuesday afternoon in the merciless heart of the dry season. The air in Mbeya village was so thick with dust you could taste it, a gritty, metallic tang that coated your tongue and stuck to the back of your throat. The heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the tin roofs, baking the red earth until it cracked like old pottery. Even the mango trees, usually resilient and green, looked defeated, their leaves coated in a dull brown film. But the heat and the dust weren't the reason the villagers had gathered outside the grand gated compound of the Okoro family. They weren't there out of concern for the weather or for each other. They were there for the spectacle. In villages like Mbeya, where the days stretched long and slow, humiliation was often a form of entertainment. It was a break in the monotony, and today's performance promised to be spectacular. The Okoro compound was the grandest structure in the village. High concrete walls painted a blinding white that required constant maintenance against the dust. A heavy iron gate emblazoned with the family crest in wrought iron, and a diesel generator that hummed aggressively all day long, giving them electricity even when the national grid failed. It was the kind of house that existed to remind everyone else of their smallness. Today, however, it would be the stage for the cruelest performance the village had ever witnessed. The heavy iron gate groaned as it swung open. A ripple of anticipation went through the crowd, a collective intake of breath. Then, from inside the compound, came the sounds of struggle, a woman's voice. High and desperate, pleading, "Please, please, Daniel, I just need my medicine, please," followed by the harsh, unmistakable bark of Mama Okoro, get out of my house." Now and then, Amara, she didn't walk out, she was shoved. The force of it was violent and sudden, sending her stumbling across the threshold and out onto the hard dirt road. She was 8 months pregnant, her belly was large and heavy and low, the way a baby sits when it is nearly ready to meet the world. She fell, not elegantly, not the way it happens in movies where the heroine swoons gently. She fell the way a real person falls when they have been pushed with real force. Her knees hit the ground first with a sickening thud. A sharp cry of pain escaped her lips, cutting through the humid air. Her hands, by pure maternal instinct, wrapped around her stomach to protect the child inside before they even thought to break her fall. She didn't think about the sharp stones cutting into her palms. She didn't think about the blood that was already beginning to seep through the fabric of her torn wrapper onto her knees. Her only thought was the baby. Her dust-covered face was a portrait of agony, both physical and something far deeper. Her eyes, wide and terrified, searched the crowd desperately, not for help. She already knew, with the bitter certainty of experience, that they wouldn't help. She was searching for one face, Daniel's, and he was there, standing just inside the open gate, framed by the wealth of his family's estate, as if he was performing a scene he had carefully choreographed in a mirror. He wore a crisp, white linen shirt, the kind of shirt that spoke of leisure and money, without a drop of sweat, without a single crease, blindingly bright against the dusty backdrop of the village. And beside him, close, intimate, possessive, stood Lena. Lena was wearing a new yellow dress. Amara recognized that yellow instantly. It was the exact same shade of fabric Amara had pointed to in the market 6 months ago, running a hand over it wistfully, saying she wanted to make something for the baby. Daniel had shrugged and said they didn't have money for frivolities. He hadn't bought it for her, he had bought it for someone else. Lena's hand rested on Daniel's forearm, her fingers manicured and painted red, and she was watching Amara in the dirt with a small, slow smile, the way a cat watches a fallen bird. That is, too injured to fly away, not rushing, savoring it. Daniel looked at his pregnant wife on the ground, the woman he had vowed to cherish, and he smirked. He actually smirked. "You want your medicine?" he said, and his voice was loud enough for the whole village to hear. He pitched it that way on purpose, projecting like an actor to the back row. "Go ask the father of that bastard you're carrying to buy it for you. From this moment, you are nothing to the Okoro family. You take nothing from this house. You have nothing. You're nothing. A wave of sound went through the crowd. It was a horrible, complex sound, part shock, part excitement, part condemnation. A man near the back shouted, "Shameless woman," his voice thick with self-righteous anger. A woman with a child on her back clicked her tongue loudly, shaking her head as if deeply disappointed, mirroring the judgment she saw around her. Someone threw a small stone. It landed in the dust 2 feet from Amara's hand. Amara looked at it. She looked at the stone, grey and jagged. Such a small thing, and yet the message it carried was enormous. You are not one of us, and we want you gone. Then Mama Okoro stepped forward. She was a compact woman, barely 5'2", but she wore power like armor. Her lace wrapper was expensive, the kind usually reserved for funerals and weddings. Today, she had dressed for a celebration. The gold at her wrists and neck caught the sun, flashing warning signals. Her face was arranged into a mask of righteous fury, but behind it, and Amara could see it. She had always been able to read people. Behind it was deep, visceral satisfaction. This was the moment Mama Okoro had been orchestrating since the day Amara first stepped out of that car 2 years ago. "Take your curse and go," Mama Okoro hissed, her voice a low, cutting thing that carried more venom than a scream. "You have contaminated this house long enough. Every misfortune we have suffered since you came, the failed harvest, the sick cattle, my son's unhappiness, all of it is on your head. You are a bad woman. You carry a bad spirit. Go. Before I have the dogs released on you." Amara was shaking. Not with fear, though. Fear was there, layered underneath like a cold current. She was shaking with the effort of not breaking. She had promised herself she would not break in front of them. She would not give them that satisfaction. She'd had made that promise in the dark, in the small hours of too many sleepless nights. When she lay on her side in the bedroom of the Okoro house, listening to Daniel come home at 2 in the morning, smelling of another woman's perfume. She had made it when Mama Okoro poured the food she had spent an hour preparing into the bin because she said it smelled wrong. She had made it when the village women had started crossing to the other side of the road when they saw her coming. She had been keeping that promise for months, soldering the cracks in herself with sheer will. Now she looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and searched for the man she had married. The man who had listened to her talk about water tables, and had called her brilliant. The man who had brought her a single red hibiscus on their 3rd date and said, "I've never met anyone like you, Amara." That man was gone. Had he ever been real? Or had she loved a reflection that he had carefully arranged to trap her? She pushed herself up from the ground. Her arms shook violently. Her knees screamed in pain. But she stood. She stood, and she put her hand on her belly, and she felt Faraha shift inside her, a soft, swimming movement, like the baby knew what was happening and was trying to reassure her mother. She did not look at the crowd. She picked up the single small bag that had been thrown after her into the dirt, one change of clothes, a small cloth, a few pictures. She turned and she began to walk. She walked slowly because there was nothing else she could do. Each step was deliberate, measured, a negotiation with gravity. She could hear them behind her. The mockery faded as she got farther from the compound, replaced by the ordinary sounds of the village, a radio playing somewhere, a child crying, a goat complaining about something. The mundane continuing while her world had just been dismantled completely. She walked until she couldn't hear them anymore, and then she walked some more, and she thought, how did it come to this? How did love become this dust road? How did a woman with a master's degree, a patent, a future, end up with bleeding knees and no phone and nowhere to go? To answer that, we need to go back. Back to where this story really starts. Back to who Amara Nwokoye really was, because the village of Mbeya had made the catastrophic error of assuming that a woman alone is a woman without power. That could not have been further from the truth. Amara Nwokoye was not just a pretty face from the city. Before she met Daniel, Amara was a force of nature. She held a master's degree in environmental engineering from one of the top universities on the continent. She was brilliant, the kind of brilliant that intimidated professors and inspired peers. Her mind worked in ways that others couldn't catch up with. While other students were partying, Amara was in the lab, obsessed with one thing: clean water. She had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about the old days, when the rivers ran clear and sickness didn't live in the water. Those stories fueled her. By the time she was 24, she'd co-founded a small green tech startup with her favorite professor. They were working on a filtration system using derived from local agricultural waste, coconut husks, and cassava peels. It was revolutionary. It was cheap to produce, easy to deploy, and it worked. They had filed a patent, but the process was slow, and funding was tight. They were on the verge of something huge, but nobody knew it yet. Then, she met Daniel. They met at a conference in the capital city. Daniel was there representing his family's agricultural business. The Okoros owned half the farmland in Mbeya and supplied produce to major supermarkets. He was charming, attentive, and seemingly humble. He listened to her talk about water tables and soil acidity with intense interest. He told her he needed someone like her, someone smart, someone who cared about the land. He courted her with a persistence that felt like devotion. "You were extraordinary up there," he told her, and he was the only person who had used that word. Not impressive. Not surprisingly good. For a woman, extraordinary. Plain, uncomplicated, full-throated extraordinary. She should have noticed the way he said it, as if he was surprised by her, as if he hadn't expected her to be so. But she didn't notice that. She noticed his eyes, which were warm, and his voice, which was gentle. And the way he kept asking questions about her work as they stood in that lobby for 2 hours. The noise of the conference swirling around them, and neither of them noticing. He told her about Mbeya. He painted it in gold, the rolling farmland. The community, the river where they swam as children. The mangoes that fell into the grass in the season and perfumed the whole village. He said he was lonely in the city during these business trips. He said he was looking for a reason to stay, to put down roots somewhere deeper than ambition. She had liked that. She had liked the idea of depth. She had been swimming so hard toward her future for so long that the idea of roots felt restful. They began to see each other. He drove up from Mbeya every weekend for 2 months. He brought her things from the village: honeycomb, sweet potatoes, a hand-carved wooden bird that he said his grandmother had made. She brought him to meet her parents after 6 weeks. Her father, the retired teacher, had looked at Daniel very carefully over the dinner table. Later, washing dishes with Amara, he had said quietly, "He is charming. Charming men can be good or dangerous. Watch which one this is." Amara had kissed her father's cheek and said, "He's good, Papa, I promise." She had believed that. The proposal came 3 months in. He took her to the rooftop of a restaurant overlooking the city at night. The ring was simple, a small diamond solitaire. She had said yes before he even finished asking. And it was then, in the warm aftermath of the yes, that she made her decision. She would not tell him. Not yet. Not about the patent. Not about pure life tech. Not about the potential valuation that Professor Adami was getting increasingly excited about. She would be Amara the woman, Amara the wife, Amara the partner. Not Amara the innovation. Not Amara the asset. She wanted to know what love looked like when it wasn't complicated by ambition or strategy. She wanted the pure, uncontaminated version. Can you understand that? She was not being deceptive. She was protecting herself. There is a difference, Daniel. Okoro was the only son of the wealthiest family in Mbeya. His father had built the farm business through genuine hard work. But Daniel had inherited the wealth without inheriting the work ethic. He was smart enough to maintain things, but not hungry enough to build new ones. In the city, he was impressive, well-dressed, well-spoken, with a family name that opened doors. But beneath the polish was a deep, unexamined insecurity. He had grown up watching his father defer to his mother on every major decision, and he had internalized that as a flaw in his father, rather than a partnership. He believed a man should never feel uncertain in front of a woman. He believed a man should be the smartest person in his marriage. With Amara, he rarely was. He didn't know how to handle that. Initially, he disguised his discomfort as admiration. Later, when she was his wife and her intelligence no longer needed to be conquered, it became something that quietly enraged him. He could not have explained it rationally. It was the thing men who are afraid of strong women can never quite articulate. The sense that her fullness somehow diminishes them, which is, of course, entirely a lie. But lies that live in the gut are hard to uproot with logic. But it was Mama Okoro who was the architect of Amara's suffering. Mrs. Ngozi Okoro had spent 40 years constructing a world in which she was the most important woman in it. She ran her family like a corporation, with herself as CEO, and she had very clear notions of what a daughter-in-law should be: subservient, local, easily controlled. When Daniel brought Amara home for the first time, Mama Okoro had looked at the elegant, educated city girl and felt a threat. Not jealousy, exactly, it was more territorial than that. Amara was not the kind of woman Mama Okoro could manage. You could not bully a woman who had written graduate theses. You could not make a woman feel intellectually inferior when she had already surpassed you academically. So Mama Okoro did what such women always do. She took the tools she did have: social influence, tradition, family loyalty, and a lifetime of practice of manipulation, and she began to work. From the very first week she set tests for Amara that she had no way of knowing about. She would serve tea at a certain time and watch Amara's reaction if she didn't offer it first. She would make comments, carefully worded, plausibly deniable, about city women, about women who work too much, about women who don't know how to nourish a husband. "My son looks thin," she would say loudly enough for the kitchen help to hear. A wife should look at her husband's belly before her own stomach. These weren't observations. They were grenades. Amara arrived in Mbaya in the first week of the rainy season. The road from the main highway to the village was unpaved and turned to red mud in the rain. The car splashed and groaned the whole way. She had pressed her face to the window and watched the landscape change, the city's glass and concrete giving way to green hills. Maize fields stretching to the horizon, women walking with basins on their heads, their bodies moving with a kind of unhurried grace that comes from a lifetime of balance. She had felt something open up in her chest. She had thought, "I can be happy here." That feeling survived approximately 4 days. On the 5th day, when Amara had suggested to one of the farm workers, gently, just a suggestion that rotating the crops in the south field might improve soil nitrogen levels, Daniel had exploded at her that evening. "Don't do that again," he said, his voice low. "Do not come into my family's business and start lecturing people. These men have farmed here their whole lives." "I wasn't lecturing," Amara said carefully. "I was just, do not do it again." She learned to stay quiet about the farming. She tried other things. She volunteered at the clinic. The nurse, Sister Philomena, was overworked and exhausted, and she was genuinely grateful. Amara reorganized their paper records into a functioning system, created a basic triage protocol, and helped translate for patients who spoke only the local dialect that Amara had begun to learn. She loved it. She felt useful again. Then Ma Okoro heard about it. "Why is my daughter-in-law in the clinic all day?" she demanded at dinner, in front of Daniel and the household staff. "Does she think she is better than the nurse God put there, or is she so bored with her own husband that she must go look for other company?" Amara had said nothing. Daniela had said nothing either. He simply poured himself more beer. That was when Amara understood that in this house, silence was Daniel's native language, and it always spoke against her. She tried the children's reading circle. She gathered 12 children under a mango tree twice a week and read to them, and then encouraged them to read aloud to each other. The parents initially liked it, for about 3 weeks. Then Mama Okoro mentioned to the village women at the market that Amara was filling their children's heads with city ideas, making them feel too important for farm work. The reading circle dissolved. She tried the Women's Vegetable Garden Initiative, the same result. Every good thing Amara attempted was quietly, methodically dismantled. And then the whisper started. "She is barren," and that was the first one. It floated through the market, settled in people's sitting rooms, was whispered during church. It was a small, poisonous word that carried enormous weight in Mbaya, where a woman's fertility was seen as inextricably linked to her worth. 12 months had passed and Amara was not pregnant. Mama Okoro had announced this to anyone who would listen as evidence of a fundamental failure. She had begun to take Amara to various traditional healers, not asking, simply telling her she had an appointment, as if Amara's body were a problem to be fixed under Mama Okoro's supervision. The healers were old, and their cures smelled of camphor and ash and things Amara could not identify. She drank what they gave her when she could stomach it, not because she believed in it, but because refusing meant war. One evening, Mama arrived at her bedroom door carrying a clay pot containing something that smelled like the inside of a swamp. "Drink all of it," she said. "This is the cure for a dry womb." Amara was 3/4 of the way through a research journal she had ordered from the capital. Tracking the latest developments in non-membrane filtration, she had continued, working quietly, writing letters by hand to Professor Ademi who would send her updates and new papers. She set the journal down and looked at the pot. "What is in it?" she asked. "It is medicine," Mama Okoro said, as if the question were an insult. "You do not question the healer's mixture. You drink. I would like to know the ingredients, because I am trying to conceive, and I want to be sure nothing in there is you, see," Mama Okoro said, and her voice rose immediately, as if she had been waiting for exactly this. "You see what I mean? This is the problem with this woman. A humble wife drinks what her mother-in-law prepares with love, A city girl interrogates me like I am a criminal. Tell me, Amara, did your university give you a degree in being impossible, or did that come naturally? She slammed the pot down on the table and swept out of the room. The next day, every woman in the market knew that Amara had refused traditional medicine because she thought she was too good for the village's ways. The story had already been edited into its most damaging form before it left the house. That was how Mama Okoro worked. She didn't lie, exactly. She selected truths, trimmed them, polished them, and presented them at the angle that did maximum damage. The isolation deepened. Women who had greeted Amara warmly in the first months began to look away when she passed. The shopkeeper at the small provision store started finding excuses not to serve her when she came alone. Oh, the item she wanted was finished. Oh, there was no change. Oh, they were about to close. Amara would walk home with nothing and quietly add it to the long ledger of small humiliations she was keeping in her heart. She found out she was pregnant on a Wednesday in the 8th month of her second year in Mbeya. She had managed to get to the clinic by herself. Sister Philomena, who still had a soft spot for Amara despite everything, let her use the clinic's testing supplies. When the line appeared, Amara had sat in the small curtained examination area for a long time, her hand flat on her abdomen, tears sliding silently down her face. Not tears of sadness. Something more complicated than that. It was fear and joy, folded together so tightly she couldn't pull them apart. She was terrified of bringing a child into this life she was living. And yet, life, her own, growing, hers. She went home and waited for Daniel. He came in late that evening, smelling of the tavern, tie loose, eyes glassy. She met him at the door with the test in her hand. Daniel, she said, and she smiled. She couldn't help it. We're having a baby. He looked at the test. He looked at her stomach. He looked at her face. And the first words out of his mouth were, "Are you sure it's mine?" The smile died on her face. It didn't fade gradually. It was simply there, and then it was gone, like a light switched off. "What? Shit," whispered. "I said what I said," Daniel replied, brushing past her into the house. "My mother says you go to the city sometimes. For your doctors, how do I know?" Amara stood in the doorway for a moment, not quite able to process what was happening. "Daniel," she said, very carefully, "the way you speak to someone who might be losing their mind. I have never been unfaithful to you. Not once. Not in thought. Not in action. There is only you. There has only ever been you. Go to bed," he said. And that was it. The conversation was over. He poured himself a drink and turned on the television. The cruelty of that dismissal, the casual, almost bored cruelty of it, was worse than if he had screamed. From that night on, everything changed. He began the process of removing her from the house piece by piece, starting with the pieces of herself she had brought. He stopped eating the meals she cooked. He stopped speaking to her at dinner. He stopped coming to bed at night. He stopped giving her money for food. "You want to eat? Ask your city friends for money," he would say. He took her phone. He had given it to her on their wedding anniversary, a touchscreen smartphone with a data plan, and it had been her lifeline, her connection to her family, to Professor Ademi, to the outside world. He picked it up from the table one afternoon while she was in the garden and put it in his pocket and never gave it back. When she asked for it, he said, "A woman with a phone has too many opportunities to betray her husband." She had stared at him. She had thought, "I do not know who this man is." She had been right, and so Amara survived. That is the only word for it. Survived. She was 6 months pregnant, living in a large, comfortable house, with electricity and running water, and yet she was effectively destitute. She scrounged food where she could, leftover rice from the kitchen when the cook had gone, fruit that fell from the trees in the compound garden, occasionally the yams and eggs that Grace passed to her through the fence when Mama Okoro was asleep. She grew thin everywhere except her belly, which continued to grow as if determined to make a point. The village women saw her and gossiped. "She looks terrible," they said. "Serves her right. She is carrying shame in that belly. Did you hear the child isn't even Daniel's?" The rumor about the baby's paternity had been planted by Mama Ok. The week after the pregnancy was announced, seeded into the community with her usual precision. "I love my son," Mama Okoro had told her inner circle of women, voice dripping with pained resignation. "But even I cannot say with certainty that this child is an Okoro, a wife who has gone half the day, who has connections in the city, who refuses traditional medicine, who can say." She didn't need to say more. The village's imagination did the rest. Amara was shamed for a child she hadn't had yet. She endured a day in early October that she would never forget. There was a village gathering, a harvest celebration, and Daniel had insisted she attend, which surprised her. She dressed carefully. In her best remaining wrapper, combed her hair, tried to make herself look presentable. She thought perhaps he wanted to make a show of normalcy. She was wrong. He sat with Lena openly, in the gathering, in front of everyone, their chairs touching, Lena laughing loudly at everything he said, leaning into him. Amara sat on the other side of the clearing, alone on a stool, her pregnant belly between her, and everyone else like a barrier. The village saw everything. Nobody came to sit with her except Grace, who appeared silently and sat down next to Amara and said not a single word, just placed her bony hand over Amara's and pressed. That small pressure of an old woman's hand held Amara together that night. When it was over and they were home, Daniel looked at her and said, "You embarrass me by sitting there like a victim. You always want people to pity you." She had gone to the bathroom and run the tap and screamed into the towel. Then she had washed her face and gone to bed. That was a Tuesday in October. She was 6 months pregnant. Chief Bosco was the kind of man who had been given authority before he was given wisdom, and the imbalance had never corrected itself. He was in his late 60s, barrel-chested, loud-voiced, and accustomed to the comfortable arrangement he had long maintained with the Okoro family. They gave him gifts, cattle, money, at elections, the occasional barrel of premium palm wine, and in return, he ensured that the village's official voice always spoke in their favor. He was not a complex villain. He was simply a man whose hunger for ease had cured him of his conscience. When Amara had gone to him, 7 months pregnant, to ask for help, to ask, formally, for a village elder to mediate with her husband, to help her get access to her phone and to basic food and safety, Chief Bosco had leaned back in his chair and looked at her over his belly and said, "Have you asked yourself, my daughter, what a husband does when a wife does not fully submit? A man goes where he is honored. Go home, be less, be less." That was the sum total of the villager's wisdom for a woman in danger. Daniel called the formal meeting in the second week of November, when Amara was 8 months along. He told Mama Okoro that morning. Mama Okoro was so pleased she made a special breakfast, her specialty Okoro fritters with ogi porridge, and brought it to Daniel and bed on a tray, something she hadn't done since he was a child. That afternoon, the village gathered in the square. The elders sat in a semicircle. Chief Bosco presided. Daniel stood and spoke with the confidence of a man who knows the judgment is already decided. "Elders of Mbia, I stand before you to dissolve my marriage to Amara, daughter of the Nwokoye family." His voice was even, almost formal. "I accuse her of infidelity. The child she carries is not mine. I will not be bound to a woman of loose character, nor will I give the Okoro name to another man's child. I have chosen Lena, a woman of our people, of known virtue, as my future wife. I ask the council to ratify this decision." Chief Bosco cleared his throat. He looked at Amara standing off to the side in her worn wrapper, her hands on her belly, her face very still. "Has the wife anything to say?" The question was perfunctory, the ritual show of fairness before a decision already made. Amara stepped forward. She looked at the elders one by one. "I have been faithful to my husband," she said. "The child I carry is his. I have not left this village in months. I have no phone, no money, no contact with anyone outside. If there is evidence of my infidelity, I ask to see it. If there is a witness, I ask them to stand before me and speak." Silence. Of course, there was no evidence. There was no witness. There was only the Okoro family's word and Chief Bosco's loyalty. "The marriage is dissolved," Chief Bosco said. And that was that, and that is where our story began. In the dust, outside the Okoro gate, with the village cheering. But now you know the full weight of the moment. You understand what led her to those bleeding knees and that hollow look in her eyes. You understand that she wasn't just a woman being divorced. She was a woman who had systematically been stripped of every protection, every resource, every connection, over the course of 2 years, and then, when she had nothing left, been thrown away. The bag that was tossed after her onto the road had, in it, one clean wrapper, one blouse, a small cloth for the baby, a handmade card from her youngest niece that she had found folded in a book before Daniel took her things, and a single photograph. The photograph was from her graduation day. She was wearing her cap and gown, laughing at something her mother had said. She looked like someone who had no idea what was coming. She clutched the photograph in her fist as she walked. She made it perhaps 1 kilometer down the road before her legs gave out. She sat down on the ground at the side of the road, leaned against a baobab tree, and allowed herself 3 minutes. 3 minutes to fall apart. She counted them. Actually, she didn't have a watch, but she counted slowly in her head. 1, 2, 3, 60, 60-1, She wept silently, her shoulders shaking, her hands over her face, and then she took a breath. And then she took another, and then she stood up. It was Grace who found her at dusk. Still walking slowly, still moving in the direction of the forest path, where there was a small river. Grace had been watching from a distance all afternoon. Heartbreaking. She had seen the eviction. She had seen everything. She appeared on the path like a shadow-given form, her small figure moving quickly despite her age. She didn't say anything. She simply ducked under Amara's arm and took her weight. "Come," Grace said. "Come." The hut at the edge of the village was small enough that Amara had to duck to enter, and it was dark inside, and it smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and something faintly sweet that Amara later realized was the wild honey Grace kept in a clay pot near the window. There was a mat on the floor and a thin blanket and a clay lamp. Grace set the lamp going and it threw warm, flickering orange light across the walls. She made Amara sit and she brought her water and a piece of cold roasted yam. Amara ate in silence. Grace watched her eat with the focused satisfaction of someone who has fed the hungry before and knows the importance of it. When she was done, Amara looked at Grace and said, "Thank you." 2 words, but they were loaded with the weight of everything. That had no other way out. While Amara was eating cold yam in a dark hut by candlelight, the world outside Mbaya was doing something extraordinary. It was looking for her. Professor Adayemi, Dr. Emmanuel Adayemi, 62 years old, grey-haired, passionate, who had spent the last 30 years trying to solve the world's water crisis, one membrane at a time, had been trying to reach Amara for nearly a year. The letters he sent never came back as undeliverable, which meant they were being received by someone. The phone calls went to a voicemail that was always full. He had even sent a junior researcher to MBA once, 6 months ago, but the reason had been told by Mama Okora at the gate that there is no Amara here, you have the wrong place, and had driven away believing her. All the while, the opportunity of a lifetime was sitting on a conference table in the capital, waiting for Amara's signature. Global Aqua Solutions, a multinational environmental technology company, had been testing Pure Life Tech's purification membrane for 8 months. Their engineers were astonished. The membrane's efficiency ratings were unlike anything on the market. The acquisition offer on the table was $4 million initially, with royalty agreements that could bring the total over 10 years to something north of 15 million. Professor Adami's hand shook every time he looked at the figure. Had called Amara's parents. Her mother answered, weeping, saying she hadn't heard from her daughter in 8 months. "She is in that village," her mother said. "I have sent letters. Nothing. I have called Daniel's phone. He tells me she is fine. She doesn't want to talk to me." But what kind of daughter doesn't want to talk to her own mother? Amara's mother had gone to the police. The police had spoken to Daniel, who had told them his wife was alive and well and had simply chosen to cut off contact with her family. Without evidence of a crime, they could do nothing. Then the African Union announcement came. Pure Life Tech, with or without its missing co-founder's presence, had been named the Continental Innovator of the Year for its water purification technology. The award ceremony in Nairobi was a major event. An empty chair sat at the table, where Amara should have been seated. The story of the missing innovator began to circulate in the press. "Where is Amara Nuno?" a journalist wrote a piece. Then another. Then a national television station picked it up. A government task force was quietly assembled, and still, the village of Mbaya sealed off from information. As remote as an island, knew none of this. Dr. Samuel Mensah was 41 years old, meticulous, and deeply idealistic in the best possible way. He had grown up in a small town, without reliable electricity, and he had carried the memory of darkness, literal and metaphorical, into his career as a government official in the Ministry of Rural Infrastructure. The Digital Horizons program was his baby. He had spent 3 years writing proposals, building coalitions, securing international funding, and navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy of government procurement to make it happen. The goal was simple and enormous: bring solar power, satellite internet, and community information screens to the 100 most information-isolated villages in the country. MBA was on the list, number 67. The satellite dish would pick up national broadcasts and internet feeds. The community television screen, mounted in the village square, would provide access to news, educational programming, and government information, Dr. Mensah believed. with the fervor of a man who had thought about it for 20 years, that the greatest weapon against poverty, injustice, and manipulation was information. People who knew things could not be lied to as I. Villages cut off from the news were villages where power could do whatever it liked, unchecked. He was right about that. The trucks arrived in Mbeya on a Thursday morning, grinding up the muddy road in a convoy of 5. The children of the village ran alongside, shrieking with excitement. The adults watched from their doorways, arms folded, curious and cautious. The Okoro compound's gate opened a crack and Mama Okoro peered out, then withdrew. The government people did not impress her. She had opinions about the government. Dr. Mensah climbed out of the lead vehicle, looked around the village square, checked his tablet, and began directing the installation team. He was efficient. The satellite dish went up on the roof of the small community hall. The solar panels were mounted on the adjacent wall. Cables were laid. A large weather-sealed screen was assembled on a frame in the center of the square. It took 3 days. On the second day of installation, Dr. Mensah took a walk. This was his habit in every village he worked in, a long, slow circuit on foot, observing, talking to whoever would talk. He noted the condition of the roads, the state of the water pump, the school building, the health clinic. He noted the Okoro compound, clearly the wealthiest property, incongruously grand for a village of this size. He noted that the water pump at the community center was broken and had been so for some time. Judging by the dryness of the surrounding ground and the worn path to the river, where women were still going for water, he walked all the way to the edge of the village where the houses thinned out and the bush began to crowd in. He saw Grace's hut. He saw a woman sitting in the doorway, nursing a baby. Something made him slow his pace. He was not a man who stared. He was too professional for that, but something pulled at his attention the way certain faces do, for reasons you cannot immediately name. The woman in the doorway had her head down, looking at the infant. She was thin, too thin. Her clothes were worn and faded. But her hands, he noticed, were beautiful and capable looking, and the way she held the baby had a studied, determined quality to it, as if she was memorizing the child. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. Their eyes met briefly. Her eyes were extraordinary, large, clear, and so intelligent that Dr. Mensah, who was not easily shaken, felt momentarily off balance. She held his gaze for 1 second without flinching or dropping her eyes, and then she looked back down at the baby, politely dismissing him. Dr. Mensah nodded and walked on. He had walked perhaps 50 meters before he stopped. He stood still on the path, frowning at nothing. Where had he seen those eyes? That face. He tried to chase it down a conference, an article. He couldn't place it. He shook his head and kept walking. He would not figure it out until the television screen was switched on. Amara went into labor 12 days after the eviction, on a Sunday night when a storm had been building all day. You could feel it coming in the quality of the air thick. A strange pressure low in her back, tightening and releasing at intervals she was trying not to count. She had told Grace she thought something was happening, tearing clean strips of cloth from an old bedsheet, heating the little cooking stone to keep the space warm. At 11 p.m., Amara's water broke. The sound she made was involuntary, a sharp Bidenoff cry that brought Grace to her feet instantly. Outside, the rain began. The drumming on the thatch roof was immediate and overwhelming. I have to get the midwife, Grace said, already wrapping her shawl. You must not deliver alone. The midwife won't come, Amara said through gritted teeth. She has been told not to help me. I'll try anyway, Grace said. And she went out into the rain. The midwife opened it and immediately, seeing who it was, began to close. And again, please, Grace begged, water streaming down her face. She is in labor. It is early. She is only 8 months. She needs a trained hand. You want me to go against the Okoros? She closed the door. Grace stood in the rain for a moment. Then she ran to Sister Philomena's house. She knocked for 3 minutes before a light came on. Sister Philomena looked through the window, saw Grace, looked away. The window went dark again. Grace ran to the house of the pastor's wife, who was known for her charity work. The pastor's wife cracked the door. Grace, she said, you know, I cannot come for that woman. My husband says we cannot be seen to oppose Chief Bosco's decision. I am sorry. She said sorry. She closed the door. She went back to her warm bed. Grace stood in the rain, soaked through, chest heaving, 82 years old, and she made a decision. She turned around and ran back to Amara. She found Amara on her hands and knees on the mat, breathing in the deep, focused way that bodies know. to do when the mind cannot think. The lamp was still burning. The boiled water was in a clay pot beside the mat. Grace stripped off her wet shawl, wiped her hands, and knelt down. They wouldn't come, she said. She did not apologize for this. Apology was useless now. Then we do it, Amara said. She wasn't asking. She wasn't panicking. She was informing the universe of its next task. Tell me what to do, Grace. The labor lasted 6 hours. Each wave of pain was a thing with its own identity, arriving, cresting, retreating, only to gather itself and return bigger. Amara made noise when she needed to and went silent when she needed to, conserve. Grace talked to her constantly, low and steady, like a running stream. She told Amara about her own children, born long ago, in this same village, without hospitals, without electricity, by the light of lamps, just like this one. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, Grace said. Long before there were doctors, long before there were hospitals. This is as old as breathing. I'm not afraid, Amara said, and it was almost true. She wasn't afraid for herself. She was afraid for the baby. It was too early at one point. Around 3 in that morning, Amara lost consciousness, briefly slipping under the surface of the pain for a few terrifying minutes. Grace shook her, called her name, pressed a cold, wet cloth to her forehead. Amara came back, gasping. I'm here, she said. Don't stop. But her body was exhausted. The months of inadequate food, the stress, the grief, all of it had taken its toll. She had less to give than she should have had. She gave it anyway. And then, at 5:20 in the morning, as the storm outside was finally easing, as the rain gentled from a roar to a whisper and the first pale gray suggestion of dawn began to soften the edge of the darkness outside the small window, a sound pierced the hut. A thin, reedy, fierce, indignant wail. The sound of a brand new person who had arrived in the world and had opinions about it immediately. Grace held up a small, dark, perfect baby girl. She was small, notably small, the size of early arrival, but she was alive, and she was loud, and she had all the things babies need to have, and her fists were clenched as if she already intended to fight. Amara reached for her, and Grace placed her in her arms. Amara looked at her daughter, really looked at her, at the tiny creased face, the miniature fingers, the shock of dark hair, and Amara, who had held herself together through months of almost impossible hardship without breaking, finally broke. She wept openly, her whole body shaking, but she was laughing through the tears too, laughing with a kind of helpless, grateful, overwhelmed joy that is one of the most human sounds a person can make. Hello, she whispered to the baby. Hello, you'll look at you, you made it. You made it through all of that, and here you are. What is her name? Grace asked softly, wiping tears of her own from her cheeks. Amara thought for just a moment. Poor Aha, she said. Joy, because they gave me everything except joy, and God put the joy inside me anyway. For 3 days after the birth, Amara barely moved. Grace was her nurse, her midwife, her mother, and her entire support system. She brought warm water for Amara to bathe with, scooping it with a cracked enamel cup. She brought the last of her rice and her dried fish and cooked them together over the small clay stove. She sat up at night when Furaha cried, so that Amara could sleep. She was 82 years old, and she did all of this on a body that ached. In places she had stopped expecting not to ache, and she did not complain once. Meanwhile, the village was busy celebrating something entirely different. On the 4th day after Furaha's birth, the Okoro compound erupted in sound and light. Daniel and Lena's engagement party was in full swing. Even at the edge of the village, in Grace's hut, the bass of the drums set up by the hired musicians reached them like a heartbeat, and the smell of roasting goat and cow reached them on the night breeze. Amara lay on the mat with Furaha on her chest and listened. Furaha was asleep, her small mouth making tiny suckling movements even in sleep, her eyelashes impossibly long against her cheeks. Amara stroked her daughter's back in slow circles, and listened to the drumbeat of her husband's celebration of his life without her. She did not cry. She was past crying about Daniel. Something harder and clearer had settled in her. She thought about the people inside that compound, eating and dancing and laughing at her expense, her husband, his cunning mistress, his cruel mother, the village that had cheered when she hit the ground. She thought about all the things they believed about her, that she was nothing, that she was destitute, that she had been reduced to her lowest and would stay there. She thought about Professor Adaimi somewhere in the city, probably frantic, who believed in her so completely that he had named a company after her vision. She thought about the patent, the technology that was in laboratories right now, being tested, being validated, being proved. She touched Furaha's soft, warm head. "They think they've finished us," she whispered. "They haven't started. One day, this village will know who your mother is. One day, the whole country will know. And you, Furaha, you will grow up proud. I promise you that." 3 weeks passed. Amara was healing. Her body, deprived of proper nutrition for months, was slow to recover. But Grace's careful nursing and the fierce will that had carried her this far kept her moving forward. She would sit in the doorway of the hut in the late afternoon and do gentle exercises to rebuild her strength. Drawing on everything she remembered from a pregnancy fitness class she'd attended briefly in the city, she breastfed Furaha on demand as much, at least, her body could do without material resources. Furaha grew. She was small but determined, feeding voraciously, sleeping in concentrated bursts, staring at the world with enormous dark eyes. That seemed to be trying to understand it as fast as possible. They had so little. Grace's food supply was chronically thin, and without money, there was no way to supplement it. Grace had a small kitchen, garden, tomatoes, sweet potato leaves. 2 papaya trees. They ate from it and were grateful. Some of the village's youngest children had begun drifting to the edge of the village path near Grace's hut in the mornings. Curious about the baby, Amara would sometimes sit with them and sing soft songs, old songs her mother had sung too. Her she was still teaching. Even now, she couldn't stop. It was as fundamental to her as breathing. Then, on a Tuesday morning, the government trucks arrived, and the village's silent isolation was about to be broken forever. The convoy of white vehicles came up the road with a sound that made the whole village pause. Dogs barked, chickens scattered, children came sprinting from every direction. 5 trucks, men in blue uniforms, equipment in crates. Something important was happening, and in a village where nothing important had happened in years, this was intoxicating. The government team worked with impressive efficiency. They surveyed the community hall roof, began mounting the solar panels, ran cables along the walls and into the interior. Then they assembled the satellite dish large and silver and pointed skyward with unmistakable purposefulness on the roof. And in the village square, they constructed a metal frame and mounted upon it the largest screen most of Mbeya had ever seen. Amara watched some of this from a distance, from the doorway of Grace's hut. She held Furaha against her shoulder and watched the silver dish rise above the community hall roof, and she felt something shift in her chest. Something she had been too exhausted to feel for a long time. Something like recognition. She knew what a satellite dish meant. She had grown up with one on her parents' roof. She knew what information could do when it was let loose in a place that had been kept in the dark. She felt it like the first distant rumble of an approaching storm. Something was coming. On the afternoon of the second day, Dr. Mensah did his customary circuit of the village. He was more troubled than he usually was on these installations. Something about Mbeya was setting off quiet alarms in him. The broken water pump, the evidence of waterborne illness in the clinic's crude paper records that he'd glanced at during a walkthrough, the disproportionate wealth of one compound relative to the rest, the strange watchfulness of the people, not the warm curiosity he usually encountered, but something more wary, as if the village had a secret it was keeping from itself as much as from him. He turned down the path that led to the edge of the village. He walked until the houses gave way to scrub, and there was the old woman's hut, and there in the doorway was the young woman with the baby. She was doing something different today. She had the baby propped up on her knees, and she was singing to it in a low voice. Some gentle rhythmic thing, and she was also speaking to it softly between the phrases of the song. In the way that people talk to babies when they think no one is watching. "That's right, Furaha," she was saying. "And one day you will go to university, and you will study whatever you want. And nobody will ever tell you that your brain is less important than your silence." She said this last part with a quiet intensity that made Dr. Mensah stop walking completely. He stood on the path and felt the strangest sensation, the feeling of something extremely important hovering just at the edge of his reach. The woman looked up. Their eyes met. Again, Dr. Mensah spoke, because something compelled him to. "Is the baby healthy?" he asked, a polite, neutral question. An excuse to linger. Amara regarded him. She is, she said. A pause. And you are from the government team? Dr. Samuel Mensah, he said. I'm leading the Digital Horizons installation. He watched her face carefully as he said his name. He saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition. Something. She looked at him with a measured interest, as if she were calculating something. The satellite dish, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said. We're switching on tomorrow evening. The whole village is invited. A slow, strange smile crossed her lips. It was not quite a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who knows something she hasn't been able to say. I know, she said. I know what a satellite dish can do. Dr. Mensah walked back to the installation, feeling deeply unsettled. He pulled out his tablet that evening and looked through his briefing notes. He did a search for missing persons in MBA region. Nothing specific came up. He put the tablet away. He couldn't place why the woman in the doorway was occupying so much of his thinking. He would understand within 24 hours. The evening before the switch on, the village was electric with excitement. Children ran to the square to look at the dark screen, pressing their fingers against a glass case. Groups of adults gathered in doorways discussing it. Daniel and Lena were seen arriving at the square during a daytime test of the solar power system. Daniel in his usual expensive shirt, Lena on his arm, looking proprietary, as if the television screen were another Okoro possession. Mahamuk had asked her household staff to set up chairs at the front of the viewing area. She was the most important woman in the village. She would sit at the front. In Grace's heart, Amara was quiet. She had fed Firaha and put her to sleep and was sitting in the doorway, watching the last of the sunset go orange behind the baobab trees. Grace came and sat beside her. Come tomorrow, Grace said. Come to the square. They will see me, Amara said. Let them. It won't be pleasant. Many things in life are not pleasant, and we still do them, Grace said. She reached over and covered Amara's hand with hers. I have a feeling, she said simply. About tomorrow. What kind of feeling? Grace smiled. She was missing 3 teeth and her face was a map of an entire life. And when she smiled, all of it was visible, the grief and the joy and the hard-won peace. The kind of feeling I used to get before the rains came, she said. When you could smell the water in the air before a single cloud had appeared. Something is about to change, child. I have learned to trust that smell. Amara looked at the old woman. She breathed in. She didn't say anything, but she thought about the satellite dish on the roof. She thought about what satellite dishes received. She thought about the outside world, so far away and yet so close now, separated only by a signal. She thought about her face, which was familiar in the capital, familiar in the press, familiar on award ceremony programs. She thought, what if? She thought, what if? They came from every corner of the village. The square filled up in the last hour before sunset, with a festive atmosphere that felt almost comical to Amara, who had lived through hell on the same patch of earth for the past 2 years. Children sat cross-legged in the front rows. Mothers held toddlers on their laps. The old men settled into their plastic chairs. The village women arranged themselves in clusters, fanning themselves, sharing snacks and chatter. Daniel and Lena were seated in the prime position. Mama Okoro's chairs were in the absolute front row, giving them a direct, unobstructed view of the screen. Mama Okoro sat between them, her lace wrapper pristine, her gold jewelry gleaming in the last of the daylight. Chief Bosco sat to the side, on a slightly raised platform because Chief Bosco always needed to be on a slightly raised platform. He had brought a special cushion. He was wearing his ceremonial robes. He looked well-fed and satisfied with himself, the way a man looks when he has successfully navigated all of life's moral choices by consistently choosing the convenient option. Amara and Grace arrived late, after most people had settled. They came from behind, moving quietly, skirting the edge of the crowd. Amara had Faraha strapped to her back with Grace's old cloth, the baby drowsy but awake, warm against her mother's. Spineley found their place under the largest baobab tree, at the back of the square, slightly to the left. In the shadow that fell between 2 strings of solar lanterns, the installation team had strung up for the occasion. From here, Amara could see the screen clearly, and importantly, in the darkness under the tree, she was largely invisible. She stood there, one hand resting on Fioha's small back, and she waited. Dr. Mensah stood at the front beside the screen, a remote control in his hand. He made a brief speech about the Digital Horizons program. He spoke about information access, about connectivity, about the government's commitment to rural development. Chief Bosco nodded aggressively throughout, as if he had personally requested it. When Dr. Mensah finished speaking, the square fell into expectant silence. He raised the remote, he pressed the button. The screen flickered, a logo spun, and then color, sound, life, the outside world, poured into Mbia Village for the very first time. The signal was a live national news broadcast. The anchors were on screen, a man and a woman, both in professional suits, seated at a desk with the national network logo behind them. The sound quality from the screen's speakers was extraordinary, crisp, clear, filling the square. The crowd was instantly mesmerized. Even the children went still, captured by the sheer novelty of the faces on the screen. The female anchor said, "Good evening. Tonight's top story. The search for a missing national hero enters its 14th month, as authorities confirmed that the investigation has been expanded to include rural communities in the northern province." She paused slightly, in the practiced way of people who understand the weight of what they are about to say. Amara Nwokoye, the 29-year-old co-founder of Pure Life Tech and the creator of the revolutionary Nyonyo water purification membrane, has been missing from public life since her marriage over 2 years ago. The mystery deepened this year when she failed to appear at the African Union Innovation Summit in Nairobi, where she was to receive the Innovator of the Year award, one of the continent's most prestigious honors for scientific achievement. In person, the screen cut to footage of an empty seat at a glittering awards ceremony. A moderator was at a podium saying, Ms. Amara Nwokoye could not be present to accept this award in person. Her co-founder, Professor Emmanuel Ademi, will accept on her behalf. The camera showed an elderly man walking slowly to the stage. His face was tired. He held the award up and then looked directly at the camera and said quietly, "Amara, wherever you are, we are looking for you. Come home, back to the anchor." In a development that has shocked the scientific community and captured national attention, Global Aqua Solutions announced last month that their acquisition of Pure Life Tech has been finalized at a valuation of $4.7 million. The anchor's voice was steady, professional. The number hung in the warm evening air above Mbia Village like a physical thing. $4.7 million. Ms. Nwokoye's family has made repeated appeals for information about her whereabouts. Her mother, Mrs. Agnes Nwokoye, spoke to reporters earlier today. A new clip played. An older woman, dignified, red-eyed, stood before a cluster of microphones. "My daughter is a good woman," Agnes Nwokoye said, her voice barely holding. "She is brilliant, she is kind, and she loved her husband with everything she had. Whoever knows where she is, please tell us. She has been gone too long. We need her home." And then the anchor said the words that changed everything. Authorities have released an updated photograph of Ms. Nwokoye, and Amara's face appeared on the screen. Not the tired, worn face of the woman standing under the baobab tree. The photograph was from 2 years ago, Amara in a tailored jacket, her hair styled, her eyes bright with confidence and purpose, laughing at something off camera. It was the photograph from the Pure Life Tech website. It was beautiful, and it was precise, and it was unmistakably the same woman. The same bone structure, the same mouth, the same extraordinary eyes. The same woman who had been on her knees in the dirt outside the Okoro gate 11 days ago. A sound went through the crowd. Not quite a gasp. Something slower. Something that started at the front, where Daniel and Mama Okoro were sitting, and rippled backward through all the rows of spectators, like a stone dropping into still water. Concentric rings of realization, moving outward. Daniel's face went through several stages in the space of about 4 seconds. You could almost chart them. First, confusion. He squinted at the screen, tilting his head slightly, the way you do when something looks familiar but context prevents the recognition. Then, a deeper, slower confusion, the kind that isn't about not knowing, but about the mind refusing to accept what it knows. Then, the color left his face completely. Not gradually, it drained, as if someone had pulled a plug somewhere. Inside him, he leaned forward in his chair, his mouth opened very slightly. His eyes went from the screen to his hands to the screen again, as if the answer might be on his palms. Beside him, Lena made a small, sharp sound, not a word, just a sound. She pulled her hand away from his arm and placed it in her own lap. She was staring at the screen with an expression that was doing the rapid arithmetic of Pinterest. Mama Okoro dropped a cup of tea she had been cradling. It hit the ground and the clay shattered, scattering fragments and cooling tea across the dirt in front of her chair. She didn't look at the cup. She was looking at the screen with an expression that, for the first time in Amara's acquaintance with her, contained something it had never contained before: fear. Chief Bosco had begun sweating in a way that was visibly apparent even from a distance. He tugged at his ceremonial collar. He shifted on his cushion. He looked at Daniel. Daniel was not looking at him. He looked at the elders. The elders were looking at the screen. He looked for an exit, but there was none, because the entire village was arranged around the square in a solid mass, and he was at the front of it. The crowd itself was reacting in a wave, people turning to their neighbors, whispering, pointing, faces cycling through disbelief and dawning horror. The midwife who had slammed her door in Grace's face during the storm put her hand over her mouth and looked at the woman next to her, who was already looking at her. The pastor's wife had gone pale. The women who had crossed the street to avoid Amara, the shopkeeper who had refused to sell to her, the children who had thrown stones at her door, all of them were now facing the same screen, and the screen was showing them the measure of their cruelty. Dr. Mensah was standing to the left of the screen when the photograph appeared. He had been observing the crowd's reaction with professional satisfaction. It was always his favorite moment, the moment a village first connected to the outside world. He expected wonder, he expected joy, he had not expected this. His eyes went from the crowd's strange reaction to the photograph on the screen, and then he went very still. The eyes in the photograph, the intelligent, calm measuring eyes that had looked at him from a doorway at the edge of the village. It was her. It was exactly her. The thinness made sense now. The worn clothes made sense now. The child on her back for Aha made sense. Now everything made a horrible, sudden, coherent sense. Dr. Mensah said excuse me to no one in particular. And then he began to move through the crowd, not walking, running. He pushed past people, not impolitely, but with urgent momentum, heading toward the back of the square. People got out of his way, startled. Heads turned to follow him. He broke through the back edge of the crowd and kept running, down the path toward the edge of the village, toward the darkness under the baobab trees, toward the place where the path curved and the scrub began. He was breathing hard. His tablet was in his hand. He rounded the curve and saw her. She was still there, standing in shadow, and she was watching him come. She wasn't running away. She wasn't surprised. She'd been waiting. Ms. Nyong'o, he said, stopping in front of her, chest heaving. He looked at her. The photograph was on the screen behind him, 100 meters away, lit up against the night sky. He looked at her face and then at the face behind him and back again. There was no doubt. None. Yes, she said. Her voice was very quiet. Amara, my God, he breathed. He looked at the baby on her back. He looked at the hut. He looked at her worn clothes. How long have you been here like this? 11 days in Grace's hut, she said. 2 years before that, in the Okoro compound. He closed his eyes briefly, the gesture of a man absorbing information he wishes were different. He opened them. Are you safe? Are you injured? Is the baby healthy? We are both alive, she said. That is more than we should be. He pulled out his satellite phone. His hands were shaking slightly. I am calling the capital right now. The task force. Your family. The minister's office. He looked at her again. You should know, everyone has been looking for you. Your mother hasn't stopped. Amara's composure, which had held through the entire evening, wobbled at the word mother. It was just slightly. Tell her, she started, and then she stopped and looked at Furaha and tried again. Tell her I have a daughter. Tell her we are both okay. Tell her, and then she couldn't continue for a moment. Tell her I'm coming home. Behind them, in the square, the crowd had understood. Or they were understanding. It was a process with several stages. First the murmurs, then the point and whisper, then the louder voices, then the full valley chaos of a community collectively realizing the magnitude of its mistake. And then someone, one of the children who had followed Dr. Mensah's sprint, pointed back toward the path and said, in a high, carrying child's voice, she's there. She's coming back. The crowd turned as one, and Amara walked through them. She had not planned it this way. She had not chosen it as a dramatic gesture. Dr. Mensah was beside her on the phone, and he was walking her to the government tent his team had set up beside the community hall. The only path to it led through the square. And so she walked. She was still in her worn, faded wrapper. She still had Furaha strapped to her back. She was still thin, still carrying the physical marks of the months she had endured, but she walked the way she had always walked when there was something important to do, with her shoulders back and her head up and her eyes straight ahead. The crowd parted for her. People stepped back on both sides, forming a corridor, and the corridor was very quiet. It was the silence of shame. She did not look at Daniel, who was standing to her left as she passed the front row. She did not look at Mama Okoro, who had covered her face with her hands. She did not look at Lena. She looked straight ahead. She walked with her daughter on her back through the village that had thrown her away, and she did not look back. What happened in the 24 hours after that night was the kind of thing that villagers remembered for generations. It became a story told and retold, though many of those who told it later would quietly revise their own roles in it, softening their cruelty in the retelling, exaggerating their helplessness, insisting they had always believed in Amara. Memory is a flexible thing when it is pressed by shame, but the facts were the facts, and the facts were being documented now by journalists, government officials, and the unblinking eye of a national conversation that would not look away. The satellite phone calls Dr. Mensah made that night traveled through bureaucratic networks at remarkable speed, because when a government minister discovers that a nationally famous missing person has been found, living in squalor in a village within his jurisdiction, the professional motivation to act quickly becomes extremely sharp. By midnight, confirmation had reached the highest levels. By 2 in the morning, a medical team was dispatched. By dawn, the first helicopter had landed in the maize field at the edge of the village, its rotors scattering seeds and dried stalks in wide arcs across the red earth, and the children of Mbeya, who had never seen a helicopter up close, stood at a safe distance and watched with expressions of bewildered wonder. By mid-morning, 3 news vans had made it up the mud road, trailing cables and cameras and journalists clutching press passes. By early afternoon, 2 more government vehicles had arrived, carrying officials from the Innovation Ministry and the Rural Development Commission. By evening, the village of Mbeya had been transformed from an isolated, self-contained world into the center of a national story, with cameras pointing outward and the outside world pointing cameras back. And somewhere in that convoy of urgency and official purpose was a smaller, silver car that meant everything. It stopped in the square, and the back door opened, and a woman got out, moving too fast for her age, across the uneven ground, guided by a government handler who was struggling to keep up with her. Amara saw her from the entrance to the government tent, and something happened to her face that no camera quite captured, though several tried. Amara's mother, Agnes Nyano, walked across the square with the focused intensity of a woman who has not slept properly in 14 months, who has spent every day of those 14 months on the phone, at police stations, in newspaper offices, making appointment after appointment, filing request after request, praying and fighting, and absolutely refusing to stop. She walked to her daughter and she put both her hands on either side of Amara's face, and she looked at her for a long, silent moment, cataloging every change, every mark, every line that hadn't been there before, the thinness of her cheeks and the steadiness of her eyes and the new, fierce quality that had settled into her features like iron hardening in a fire. And then Agnes Nyano pulled her daughter close and held her with a kind of grip that says, I found you, and I am never letting go again. She wept with a wholeness and abandon that the entire watching crowd found unbearable to witness, not because it was theatrical, but because it was so entirely real. Little Furaha, still strapped to Amara's back, made a small, startled sound at the sudden emotion around her, and then Agnes pulled back and saw her grandchild for the first time. And a new wave of tears came, different tears, mixed with astonishment and love and grief for the child who had been born into difficulty and was now, for the first time, being held by family. Agnes took the baby with the practiced confidence of a grandmother, and Furaha regarded her with those enormous, searching eyes, and then, with the cosmic pragmatism of infants, decided she was acceptable and relaxed into her arms. An hour later, a black SUV pulled up and Professor Ademi climbed out, looking older than Amara remembered, his grey hair now fully white, his face deeply lined with the specific aging that comes from prolonged worry. He had been notified at 2 in the morning and had driven through the night without sleeping. He carried a leather briefcase that he held close to his chest, and he moved with the careful urgency of a man transporting something precious. He saw Amara from across the square and stopped walking entirely for a moment. He took off his glasses and cleaned them, which Amara had always known was his way of giving himself 30 seconds to collect himself, and then he put them back on, and came to her and took both her hands in both of his. You are here, he said. His voice was very quiet. You are here. I am here, Professor, she said. He looked at her face for a long moment, reading it the way he read experimental data, carefully, completely, noting every variable. Then he nodded once, a nod that carried in it everything he had been afraid of, and everything he was relieved to find was untrue, he told her. There in the government tent, while the village swirled with chaos outside, about everything that had happened in her absence, the patent approval, the testing results from Global Aqua Solutions Laboratory, the acquisition offer, the award, the search, the articles, the National Task Force. He told her about her mother's campaign, how Agnes had gone to the press, to the police, to her member of parliament, to anyone who would listen. He told her that her name had been on the lips of the scientific community for months, with each piece of information. Amara's expression shifted, not with surprise, exactly. It was more like vindication, the quiet confirmation of something she had always believed but had never been able to prove while she was trapped in the dust of Mbia when he was finished. Professor Ademi opened his briefcase and placed documents on the folding table between them, the acquisition agreement. Her signature was required to finalize the deal. Lobo Aqua Solutions had been, as he put it, remarkably patient. They wanted her technology. They had always wanted her technology, and nothing that had happened to Amara in a remote village had changed the value of what her mind had created. The number on the document, $4.7 million, in clean black type, looked almost abstract on paper, almost impossible. Amara stared at it for a moment. Then she picked up the pen. Asterisk, the investigation into Daniel and the family began moving quickly. The media scrutiny was thorough and merciless, not because journalists are cruel, but because injustice, when exposed, requires a certain thoroughness to fully account for itself. Neighbors gave interviews. The clinic workers spoke. Village women who had previously crossed the street to avoid Amara now found themselves telling cameras what they had seen and done, and many of them wept as they spoke, the specific weeping of people who have realized, too late, that they were on the wrong side of something. The midwife who had slammed the door during the labor was identified by name. She did not appear on camera. She sent a written statement that said she was misled by circumstances. Chief Bosco gave a rambling interview from his porch in which he described himself as a victim of a misunderstanding. 3 days later, the Ministry of Local Government stripped him of his title. Pending a formal investigation into years of corruption and embezzlement, he was seen leaving the village in a borrowed truck, his ceremonial cushion under his arm, his robes in a bag. There was no crowd to see him off. Lena had been smarter than most. She had read the room the moment the television screen lit up. She had left MBA before sunrise on the morning after the revelation, packing her bags in the dark, slipping out on a motorbike, not leaving a note or a forwarding address. In the press coverage that followed, she was referred to simply as a woman identified as Daniel's companion at the time of the separation. It was accurate, and in its accuracy, it was devastating. Not for being cruel, but for being so perfectly. Finally, Daniel came on the evening of the second day. The security team Dr. Mensah had arranged around the government tent tried to turn him away, but Daniel was in the grip of a desperation that made him persistent in a way he had never been about anything that mattered. He managed to get close, enough to call her name. Amara heard it from inside the tent, heard the cracked, raw quality in his voice. The specific crack of a man who has at last fully understood the weight of what he chose. She stepped outside. He was on his knees. Not performatively, he was genuinely, desperately, humiliatingly on his knees in the dirt of the village square, in the exact place where he had publicly annihilated her, in the same dust she had been. Thrown into dissymmetry was brutal and precise. He was unshaved. His expensive shirt was wrinkled and stained. His eyes were red. He had the hollow, haunted look of a man who had been awake for 36 hours with nothing to do but understand himself, and who had not enjoyed the process. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice broke on the second word. "I know that isn't enough. I know there is nothing I can say that is enough. But I was everything wrong. Everything my mother told me to be, and nothing good. Nothing of what I promised you when you said yes to me. I was weak, Amara. I was weak and I was a coward, and I let people who didn't deserve the power make my choices for me. Please." He was weeping openly now. "Please." She stood above him, Faraha in her arms, and she looked at this man she had once loved so completely that she had left her entire life behind for him. She looked at him kneeling in the dirt, and she felt not satisfaction. She had expected to feel satisfaction. She had sometimes, in the dark nights, in Grace's hut, imagined a moment like this and thought she would feel something fierce and Heart stead. What she felt was something close to grief. Not for herself, she was past mourning her own losses. Grief for the waste of it, the waste of what he could have been, the years that were gone, the childhood he would not have with his daughter. Daniel, she said, and her voice was steady and low. You didn't just betray me. I need you to understand that, and I need you to carry it. You denied your own child before she was born. You let her come into the world on a dirt floor in a storm with no doctor, no family, no safety, because you were so committed to your lie that you would rather let an innocent baby be born in danger than admit the truth. That is not a mistake. A mistake is forgetting something, or misjudging something. What you did was a choice, made over and over, every day, for months, and the person most harmed by it was not me, it was for... She looked down at her daughter, who was awake, watching Daniel with those enormous, calm, uncomprehending eyes. She will know who you are, Amara said. I will not hide you from her. I am not going to teach her to hate you. But I am also not going to pretend you were something you weren't. You were given the gift of this child and you rejected her. That is what you will live with. Not my judgment. Your own. She turned to the security officer beside her and nodded. Please, remove. And she went back inside. Mama Okoro made one attempt. She appeared at the tent entrance the following morning in fresh lace, her gold jewelry catching the sun. Her expression arranged into the composed, warm concern of a woman who has decided that audacity is her only remaining option. She smiled at the security officer with the confident entitlement of someone who has never been told no and has decided, despite all evidence, that today will be no different. I am the mother-in-law, she announced pleasantly. I am here to see my daughter. She was not on the authorized visitor list. She was asked to step back. She stood her ground. Then Agnes Niano appeared in the tent entrance behind the security officer, and the temperature of the interaction changed instantly. Agnes looked at Mama Okoro for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice of such controlled and focused fury that even the security officer went very still, you burned her letters, you confiscated her phone, you orchestrated 2 years of social isolation against a pregnant woman. You told the midwife not to come when she went into labor. Every sentence was supported by testimony. Every sentence was already in the record. I suggest, Agnes said, that you speak to a lawyer before you speak to anyone else. Mama Okoro's smile, which had been decreasing by increments throughout this speech, was now gone entirely. She looked at Agnes, and then at the cameras positioned around the square, which were watching everything, and she turned and walked away. She walked back to the Okoro compound and the great white gate closed behind her, and it stayed closed. The press conference was held on the third morning, in the village square, with the satellite dish gleaming on the community hall roof as a backdrop that felt almost intentional in its symbolism. The light was clean and golden, a particular quality of post-train mornings in that region, where the air has been washed and everything stands out in sharp relief. Every journalist who had made the journey to Mbia was there, cameras rolling. The government officials were present. The village was present. Every single person gathered in the square for the third time in a week, but in a very different silence than the previous gatherings. This silence had shame in it. It had the quality of a collective breath being held. Amara stood at the microphone. She was wearing clean clothes. Her mother had brought things from the city. She had slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks. She had eaten properly for 3 days. She looked, for the first time in the camera's experience of her, like herself, like the woman in the Pure Life Tech photograph, not identical to it. Because 2 years of what she had endured had changed her face in ways that time and rest alone could not undo. But carrying the same essential quality, the quality of someone who knows exactly who she is. She held Furaha dressed in a small white sleep suit that Agnes had brought, and Furaha was looking at the crowd with the same intense, measuring gaze she brought to everything, conducting her own investigation into the nature of human beings from a vantage point of 10 days of life. Agnes Niano stood behind Amara's left shoulder. Professor Adaimi stood behind her right. Dr. Mensah stood to the side, at a respectful distance. Amara looked at the microphone for a moment, gathering herself. Then she spoke. I am not going to use this moment to catalogue what was done to me, she said. Her voice was clear and carried easily without the microphone. But into it she spoke with a measured calmness that the journalists later described as more affecting than anything louder could have been. The facts are in the record. The evidence has been collected. The appropriate authorities are handling the appropriate matters. What I want to talk about, instead, is what I am going to do, because that is the only thing, ultimately, that is fully under my control. She looked around the square. She looked at the faces of the people who had cheered when she was thrown in the dirt, at the women who had crossed the street, at the children who had thrown stones at her door. She looked at all of them with an expression that was neither cold nor forgiving. It was something more complex than either. It was the look of someone who has thought about this for a long time and arrived somewhere that is neither revenge nor forgetting, but a third thing that takes more strength than either. There are children in this village, she said. Children who had nothing to do with what happened to me. Children who sat under a mango tree and listened to me read to them before their parents were persuaded to keep them away. Children who, you deserve a real school with real teachers, real textbooks, real futures. I am funding that school. Construction will begin within 60 days. It will be fully equipped and professionally staffed, and it will be free to every child in MBA. A ripple of sound went through the crowd. She continued. There are women in this village who have no access to proper maternity care. Of a woman in this village nearly died giving birth, and a baby nearly never drew breath, because the village's midwife chose loyalty to power over her basic duty of care. The maternity and health clinic I am funding for this village will serve every woman and every child, regardless of their family name or their social standing. It will be staffed by trained medical professionals. Construction begins concurrently with the school. She paused. The square was absolutely silent. Both facilities will be part of the Faraha Trust, registered this week, funded through a portion of the Pure Life Tech acquisition proceeds. The trust will also oversee the installation of the Neono water purification system in this village, the same technology that this country has celebrated, and that this village never knew was created by someone living in their midst. Every family in Mbeya will have access to clean drinking water. She stopped for a moment. Someone in the crowd had begun to cry, not the dramatic weeping of performance, but the quiet, helpless weeping of someone who has just fully understood the scale of what they nearly lost, including the Okoro family, Amara said. Because I have decided that withholding clean water from anyone, for any reason, is not justice. It is cruelty. And I have had enough of cruelty for one lifetime. Finally, she said, and her voice softened slightly, I want to name the clinic, because naming is important. Because we remember what we choose to honor. The clinic will be named the Grace Center. She looked to the side of the small stage, where Grace was standing. Agnes had given Grace a clean wrapper that morning, a soft blue one, simply patterned, and Grace was wearing it with the slightly overwhelmed dignity of someone who is not accustomed to being looked at, but is trying to be worthy of the occasion. She was holding her hands together in front of her, watching Amara with eyes that were full and bright. This woman, Amara said, is the real story of Mbeya, not the betrayal, not the cruelty, not the shame. This woman who had nothing, who had been discarded by this community years before I ever arrived, who was 82 years old and who carried water and boiled rags and stayed awake through the night and delivered my daughter with her bare hands when no one else would come. This woman is the reason Furaha and I are standing here. Her name should outlast every one of us. Grace made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and pressed her hands over her mouth. The crowd was weeping. Not performatively, they were weeping the way people weep when something real has happened to their understanding of themselves, when the mirror has been held up and the reflection is not comfortable but is true. Even the journalists had gone quiet. Their professional detachment surrendered to the simple weight of the moment. Dr. Mensah was staring at the floor of the stage with the expression of a man who is glad he chose the work he chose you left on. On Friday, the morning was clear and warm, the kind of morning that feels like it is trying to make amends for the weather of recent weeks. The government team was staying on. There was more work to do, surveys and measurements for the school and clinic, paperwork for the water system contract, follow-up with the trust's local administrators. But Amara was done. She had given what she was compelled to give. She had said what needed to be said, and her body, still healing from months of deprivation and the physical trauma of childbirth, and her daughter, still in the early, irreplaceable weeks of life, and her heart, which was carrying more than it wanted to hold, all of them needed to go home. She said goodbye to Grace last. They stood outside the small hut at the edge of the village, the hut that had been a palace because it was safe, that had sheltered two lives through a storm, that was only one room and a leaking roof and a dirt floor, and yet had contained more genuine humanity than the grand white compound at the center of the village. They held each other for a long time without speaking. Grace smelled of wood smoke and wild honey and the dried herbs she always kept near the window, and Amara breathed it in deliberately, filing it away, memorizing it. "You saved us," Amara said. "You saved us both." "You saved yourself," Grace said firmly. "I just made sure you had somewhere warm to do it." Amara pulled back and looked at the old woman's face, the map of a whole life. Every line a chapter, every wrinkle a year of carrying things without complaint. "You are coming to the city," Amara said. "That is not a request. You are coming to visit, and then you are coming to the Furaha Trust Board meetings. And you are the honorary director of this trust for as long as you choose to be, and I will not accept any argument about it." Grace laughed. "An old woman on a board? An old woman who is the reason the board exists," Amara said. She kissed Grace's cheek. She walked to the waiting car. It was a government vehicle, clean, with enough room for her mother and Professor Adaimi and little Faraha in a brand new car seat that had arrived with the supply convoy. Dr. Mensah was there at the car to see her off. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has been part of something he will spend the rest of his career thinking about. "Safe travels, Ms. Niono," he said. "We will ensure the projects are completed on schedule and properly supervised." "I know you will," she said. "Thank you, Dr. Mensah, for running." He smiled at that, a surprised, genuine smile. "In retrospect, I should have run sooner." She got into the car. Faraha made a small sound from her car seat, a comfortable, drowsy sound. The sound of a baby who is warm and safe and has been fed and is now doing the serious work of being a small person in the world. Agnes reached across and took Amara's hand. The doors closed. The convoy began to move the road through the village to the main highway past the Okoro compound. Amara had not requested this route, it was simply the only route. As the convoy moved through Mbeya's main road, the village people lined both sides of the path and watched. Not cheering, not this time, not throwing stones, simply watching, with the chastened, subdued attentiveness of people who have been shown something about themselves and are still processing it. The midwife was there, standing in front of her house, her eyes on the ground. The pastor's wife was at her window. The shopkeeper stood in his doorway. Every person who had been part of this story, in one way or another, watching the ending of it. As the car approached the Okoro compound, Amara looked up. She couldn't help it. Daniel was standing at the gate of his family's great white estate, alone. No Lena, no Mama Okoro, no household staff. Just him, standing in the open gateway of all his inherited wealth, watching the convoy pass. He looked older. His shoulders carried something heavy that they hadn't carried before. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a very large, very permanent understanding, the weight of who he had chosen to be and what it had taken from him that he could never get back. As the car drew level with him, for one brief second, their eyes met through the window. Amara looked at him, and then she looked away, not with anger, not with contempt, simply with the quiet, decisive finality of a woman who has made her peace with a chapter and is turning the page. The car drove on. The dust rose behind it in a long red plume and settled slowly back over the road, and the village of Mbeya grew smaller in the rear window, and then the trees closed in on either side, and then there was only the highway, the horizon, and the open road ahead. There is something this story asks us to sit with, something beyond the dramatic resolution, beyond the symmetry of justice, beyond the deeply satisfying fact of a satellite dish arriving at precisely the right moment in precisely the right village. It asks us to think about what we choose to see when we look at people. The village of Mbeya looked at Amara and saw a liability, a failed wife, a city girl who had been found out. They reduced her to the smallest possible version of herself and treated her accordingly, with a confident cruelty that was all the more devastating for how casual it was. They looked at a woman who had spent her entire adult life trying to solve one of humanity's most urgent problems, the problem of dirty water, of preventable death, of children losing years of their lives and their minds to illness that cleaner water would cure, and they threw stones at her door. They looked at a woman with a patent worth millions and called her barren and cursed. They looked at a woman who had endured more emotional violence than most people could imagine and called her weak. They were wrong about every single thing. But here is what I want you to carry away from Amara's story. She didn't survive because she was wealthy. She wasn't wealthy in Mbeya. She survived because of something that wealth cannot buy and poverty cannot take away, the refusal to let someone else's cruelty write the final line of her story. She had every reason to give up. In the objective accounting of her situation, she was stranded, penniless, isolated, heavily pregnant, with no phone, no allies, no family, no resources. On paper, she had lost. But Amara understood something that Daniel and Mama Okoro and Chief Bosco and all the stone throwers of Mbeya never grasped. that the value of a person is not determined by who is watching. That dignity is not a gift that other people grant you. It is something you carry inside yourself, and it survives everything, absolutely everything, as long as you refuse to put it down. She'll never put it down, not when she was thrown in the dirt, not when she gave birth on a floor in a storm, alone in the dark with an old woman's hands and a cracked clay lamp for company, not when she lay on a thin mat and listened to the drums of Daniel's engagement party drifting across the night air. She held her daughter and she made a promise, and then she simply waited. She waited with the patience of someone who understands that truth is not fast, but it is inevitable. She waited like someone who knows that the satellite dish or something like it, some form of light and signal and connection, always eventually arrives. Asterisk, and the world was always going to find her, because you cannot bury light. You can cut the wires, you can confiscate the phone, you can burn the letters, you can forbid the help and drag the woman to the dirt, and surround her with the roaring approval of an entire village's cruelty. And still, the light finds its way through. It finds the crack in the wall. It writes the signal of a government satellite dish on the roof of a community hall in the most isolated village on the route. It plays on a screen in a square where the very people who committed the injustice are seated in the front row. It speaks the name they tried to erase. It shows the face they tried to shame. And it asks, simply and without drama, is this the person you thought you were dealing with? Is this the woman you threw away? Truth does not shout. It doesn't need to. It simply arrives, eventually, and when it does, it is louder than everything that tried to silence it. As for Daniel, he stands at his gate every evening now. They say, in the long silence of the compound after the business partners have stopped calling and the household staff have reduced to one and the family name no longer commands what it used to command. He has his house. He has his land. He has his mother who has grown very quiet. He does not have Faraha. He does not have Amara. He made his choices, and now he lives inside them, in the particular loneliness of a man who was given something irreplaceable and treated it like it was ordinary. That is not revenge. That is simply the shape of the life you build with the decisions you make, day after day, when you think no one important is watching. He was wrong about who was important. And Amara is in the city. She is working. She is working with the energy of a woman who has been confined and is now fully, finally, unreservedly unleashed. The Pure Life Tech acquisition is complete. Her name is on the check. Her name is on the Innovation Award that now hangs on the wall of her office. Beside the photograph of herself and Professor Adayemi at the signing table, and beside that, in a small frame that she put there herself, a photograph of Grace, 2 years old, Gaptith smile, wearing the blue wrapper, standing in front of the construction site of the clinic that will bear her name. Amara keeps that photo closest to her desk. Of all of them, it is the one she looks at most. The school in Mbaya opened 8 months after Amara left. The clinic opened 2 months after that. The water system was running within a year. Dr. Mensah sent her photographs at each milestone, the ribbon cutting, the first children filing into classrooms, the first clean water running from the taps in a village where women had been walking to the river for generations. Grace attended every ceremony. In the photographs she is always smiling, always standing very straight, always looking slightly surprised by the size of her own importance. Amara looks at those photographs and something in her chest does a thing it couldn't do for a long time. It rests. On Friday evenings, when the work is quiet and the city darkens and the stars come out above her apartment building, Amara puts Firaha on her lap and they sit by the window together. Firaha is growing fast, everything fast, reaching for everything, grabbing at the world with both fists, as if she arrived late and is making up for it. She reaches for the stars through the glass. Amara watches her daughter and thinks about Grace's words, the smell of rain before the clouds appear. She thinks about the satellite dish on the roof. She thinks about the moment the screen lit up in the village square and the truth came, pouring in like water through a broken dam. She thinks about the baby who was born in a storm on a dirt floor and was given the name Joy. She thinks, they tried to take everything from us. And look at us now. The village of Mbeya shamed a pregnant woman. They threw her into the dust and watched her walk away and they thought it was an ending. They didn't know it was a beginning. They didn't know that the woman walking away from them in the dust was carrying, in her body and in her briefcase and in the locked drawer of Daniel Okora's bedroom, the seeds of something enormous. They didn't know that the silence they had built around her was only waiting for the right signal to break. And when the satellite dish arrived, silver and tall and pointed skyward with perfect, purposeful certainty, it brought not just news, it brought the truth. The same truth that had always been there, walking down that dust road with its head up and its hands on its belly and its dignity intact. The satellite dish brought the news, but Amara had always been the story. There is nothing in this world, no cruelty deep enough, no betrayal complete enough, no village loud enough in its condemnation that can take a woman down. If she carries her dignity like armor and her purpose like a lantern, remember that, hold on to it, because somewhere, right now, there is a woman walking down a dust road who has been told she is nothing, and she is not nothing. She is not nothing at all.